The auction hammer fell with a crack that echoed across the dusty courtyard of Thornhill Station as Samuel Thompson watched his wife and two young ones torn from his arms and sold to separate bidders. But fate had a crueler twist waiting. A wealthy rancher named Matthew Moore stepped forward with enough gold to reunite them, purchasing the entire Thompson family with what seemed like an act of mercy. The enslaved witnesses who watched that September day in 1852 knew better. They recognized the cold calculation behind Moore's generosity, the way he examined the family like livestock being selected for slaughter rather than labor. What appeared as compassion masked something far more sinister. This transaction would expose a network of death that stretched across 3 territories, where certain masters didn't buy enslaved people to work their land, but to feed an appetite for cruelty that most refused to believe existed. The Thompson family's survival would depend on witnesses finding their voices before Moore's twisted enterprise claimed more victims. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September sun beat down on the auction platform at Thornhill Station as Samuel Thompson felt iron shackles bite into his wrists, the metal warm from bodies that had worn them before. Dust swirled through the Virginia trading post where 3 territories met, carrying the scent of horse sweat and human desperation. Behind him stood his wife Talise and their 2 teenagers, chained together like cattle awaiting slaughter, while wealthy ranchers examined them with the cold assessment of men purchasing tools rather than human beings. The auctioneer's voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade. "Fine family unit here, folks. Strong buck, healthy woman, 2 half-grown workers, selling separate or together, depending on the price." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched bidders circle, some interested in him alone for heavy labor, others eyeing Talise with intentions that made his stomach turn. His son James, barely 15, stood rigid with fear. His daughter Abigail, 13, pressed close to her mother, tears streaking the dust on her face. This moment would shatter one family and expose the darkest corners of an institution that claimed to be about labor and economics. But the truth, waiting at Moore's ranch, had nothing to do with cotton or cattle. Some men bought enslaved people to work their land. Matthew Moore bought them to satisfy appetites that most refused to believe existed. The bidding started at $200 for the family unit. Separate offers came quickly, ranchers calling out prices for individual members. Samuel felt Talise's hand find his despite the chains, her fingers trembling against his palm. 15 years of marriage, 2 beautiful souls they'd raised despite impossible circumstances, all about to be torn apart by the highest bidder. Then Matthew Moore stepped forward from the back of the crowd. His boots clicked against the wooden platform as he approached, a tall man in expensive clothes that marked him as one of the territory's wealthiest landowners. The Moore Ranch sprawled across 20,000 acres of prime grazing land, worked by over 200 enslaved people who whispered stories that other plantations dismissed as exaggeration or lies. "I'll take the whole family," Moore announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. $1,000 gold. The crowd fell silent. It was triple the asking price, an amount that made no economic sense for a rancher supposedly seeking laborers. The auctioneer's eyes widened with greedy satisfaction as he called for competing bids that never came. Who would challenge such an offer? Samuel watched Moore's face as the transaction concluded, searching for some hint of the mercy that such a purchase might suggest. A man willing to keep a family together, perhaps there was kindness there. But Moore's pale eyes held no warmth as they swept over his new property. Instead, Samuel saw the careful evaluation of a predator selecting prey, the cold calculation of someone executing a well-practiced plan. The enslaved witnesses who'd been brought to Thornhill Station by their own masters recognized something Samuel couldn't yet see. An old woman named Zarina, property of a neighboring rancher, made brief eye contact with Talise and shook her head almost imperceptibly. A young man called Anthony, chained to a wagon nearby, closed his eyes as if witnessing something too painful to watch. They knew Moore's reputation. They'd heard the stories that white society refused to believe. But what could they say without facing the lash, or worse? So they watched in helpless silence as another family was led toward a fate that had already claimed too many victims. From a letter discovered years later, written by a circuit judge to his brother in Richmond, dated September 1852. Moore made another purchase at Thornhill Station today. Whole family this time. The pattern continues, yet local authorities refuse to investigate, despite mounting evidence. How many must disappear before someone with power chooses to see what's happening in plain sight? The wagon ride to Moore's ranch took 3 days across territory that grew increasingly isolated with each passing mile. The landscape shifted from settled farmland to wild grasslands, dotted with rocky outcrops and stands of pine. Talise held her daughter close while Samuel and James sat in silence, all of them trying to make sense of what had just happened. Moore rode ahead on a black stallion, never looking back at his purchase. 2 armed overseers flanked the wagon, men whose faces carried the hardened expression of people who'd witnessed terrible things and learned to feel nothing. They offered no water during rest stops, no shade from the relentless sun, no acknowledgement that their cargo consisted of human beings rather than livestock. "Why did he pay so much?" James whispered to his father during their second night camped under stars that seemed impossibly distant. "If he wanted workers, he could have bought us separate for less." Samuel had no answer that wouldn't terrify his son further. Instead, he pulled the boy close and promised protection he wasn't sure he could provide. Talise sang softly to Abigail, old songs passed down through generations, melodies that carried hope even when words failed. The Moore Ranch appeared on the third afternoon like a monument to wealth, built on human suffering. The main house rose 3 stories high, built from imported stone that gleamed white against the brown grasslands. Outbuildings spread in every direction, stables, storage barns, quarters for the enslaved workers who kept the empire running. Cattle grazed across endless pastures while horses ran in carefully fenced corrals. But something felt wrong about the property. Too quiet, despite the number of people who should be working there. Too still, as if the land itself held its breath in anticipation of horrors it had witnessed too many times before. A woman emerged from the main house as their wagon approached. Grace Harris, Moore's housekeeper, and the person who managed the day-to-day operations of the enslaved workforce. Her face carried the careful neutrality of someone who survived by seeing nothing, hearing nothing, and speaking even less. "Take the man and boy to the south quarters," she instructed the overseers without meeting Samuel's eyes. "Woman and girl, come with me to the main house." "No," Samuel said, the word escaping before he could stop it. "He bought us as a family. We stay together." Moore had dismounted and now turned to face this challenge to his authority. His expression remained pleasant, almost amused, but his eyes held the cold patience of a snake deciding when to strike. "You'll go where I tell you to go," he said softly, "and you'll do what I tell you to do. That's how property works, Samuel. You belong to me now, all of you." What drives a man to purchase human beings not for their labor but for darker purposes? How does a society look away from evil happening in plain sight because acknowledging it would force uncomfortable questions about the entire system? As the Thompson family was separated on their first day at Moore's ranch, none of them yet understood the true horror of what they'd been bought for. But the witnesses who'd watched Moore operate for years knew exactly what was coming, and their silence weighed heavier with each new family that disappeared behind those white stone walls. The south quarters consisted of 12 rough-hewn cabins arranged in 2 rows, their walls chinked with mud that barely kept out the wind. Samuel and James were shoved into the last structure, where 3 other men already slept on dirt floors covered with moldy straw. The air inside smelled of unwashed bodies, despair, and something else Samuel couldn't identify but made his skin crawl with instinctive dread. "Don't talk first night," one of the men muttered without looking up. His name was Logan, Samuel would learn later, and he'd been Moore's property for 8 months. "Just listen, learn the rules. Might live longer that way." The Moore Ranch operated under systems that appeared normal on the surface, but concealed mechanisms designed for purposes that had nothing to do with agricultural production. The cattle operation was legitimate enough, providing cover for the property's real function. But the enslaved population divided into 2 distinct groups: field workers who tended livestock and maintained the ranch, and house workers who disappeared into the main building and rarely emerged. Grace Harris ran the household with mechanical efficiency that suggested someone who'd learned to function without feeling. She assigned to kitchen duties alongside 2 other women, Mia and Hannah. both of whom moved through their tasks with the haunted expressions of people who'd seen things that broke something essential inside them. Abigail was separated immediately, taken to the third floor where Moore kept what he called his, quote, special staff. Talace's screams as her daughter was led away echoed through the house until Grace slapped her hard enough to leave a handprint. "Screaming don't help nothing here," Grace said, her voice flat and empty. "You want to see her again, you learn to be quiet. You learn to do exactly what you're told. You learn that some things can't be fought, only survived." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The main house revealed itself slowly to those forced to work within its walls. The first floor appeared normal enough. Parlor, dining room, study, all decorated with expensive furniture and artwork that proclaimed Moore's wealth and taste. The second floor contained bedrooms and storage, nothing remarkable for a man of his status. But the third floor remained locked to most of the household staff. Only Grace held keys to those rooms, and only certain enslaved people were ever summoned upstairs. Those who went up rarely came down the same. Some emerged hollow-eyed and silent. Others never emerged at all. From the hidden journal of Mia Davis, houseworker, entries discovered decades later. 3 families since I came here. The Robinsons lasted 2 months before the father tried to run. They caught him, made us all watch what happened next. The Garcias, 6 weeks. Little girl stopped screaming after the first week upstairs. Just stared at walls until she stopped eating altogether. Now the Thompsons. Lord help them. Lord help us all for what we witness and cannot stop. The field workers knew fragments of truth, but not the complete picture. They saw families arrive and noted when members disappeared. They heard occasional screams from the main house on certain nights, when Moore entertained guests who arrived after dark and left before dawn. They observed the pattern of fresh graves in the far pasture, supposedly for workers who died from disease or accidents. But speaking these observations aloud meant death. Moore employed overseers who specialized in making examples of anyone who questioned the operation. Bodies displayed as warnings, punishments designed to terrorize the entire enslaved population into complicit silence. Samuel discovered the truth gradually through whispered conversations in the south quarters, after the overseers completed their nightly rounds. Logan had been purchased with his brother, a man named Ryan who'd been taken to the main house 6 months ago and never returned. "Moore don't buy people to work them," Logan explained in the darkness, his voice barely audible. "He buys them for something else. Something the authorities won't believe, because it's too horrible for decent folks to accept that one of their own could do such things." "What things?" Samuel asked, though part of him already knew the answer would confirm his worst fears. "Things I can't say out loud," Logan replied. "Things that would get me killed just for speaking them. But you got family in that house. You need to know that Moore, he likes hurting people. Not quick, like an overseer with a whip. Slow. Methodical. He studies how much pain a person can take before they break, how long he can keep them alive while doing things that no human should do to another." The ranch existed as a carefully constructed facade that allowed Moore to indulge appetites that even slave-holding society would condemn if they acknowledged them. He targeted families specifically because their bonds made them more interesting subjects for his experiments in suffering. He enjoyed watching parents choose between their own survival and their offspring's safety, forcing impossible decisions that destroyed people from the inside out. His wealth and social position provided perfect cover. Who would believe that a respected rancher, a man who donated to churches and hosted political gatherings, was actually a sadist who'd perfected the art of torture under the legal protection slavery provided? The system that made human beings property also made their suffering invisible, their testimonies worthless, their deaths unremarkable. Grace Harris embodied the moral compromise required to function within Moore's empire. She'd been enslaved her entire life, passed between owners who used her in various ways before Moore purchased her 15 years ago. She survived by becoming exactly what he needed: an administrator who could manage his property without emotional attachment, who could facilitate horrors without protest, who understood that resistance meant death, while cooperation meant continued existence. From a letter between Moore and another rancher, dated October 1852, discovered in a strongbox years later, the new family shows promise. The father has spirit that will be entertaining to break. The woman possesses strength that will provide interesting challenges. The young ones are at ideal ages for my purposes. I expect several months of productive study before they're exhausted. Your visit next month should coincide with peak results. The enslaved community at Moore's Ranch lived in constant terror, divided between those who worked fields and rarely saw the main house, and those who worked inside and witnessed horrors they could never speak about. Both groups understood they were trapped in a system where even their suffering had been commodified, where their pain existed to satisfy one man's twisted desires. Talise worked in the kitchen, her hands moving automatically through tasks, while her mind screamed with worry about Abigail locked somewhere above. She caught glimpses of her daughter twice during the first week, each time noting how the girl's eyes had become more distant, how she moved like someone whose spirit was being systematically crushed. The kitchen staff never spoke directly about what happened upstairs, but sometimes Hannah would weep silently while kneading bread, tears falling into dough that would feed the man who'd destroyed her own family. Sometimes Mia would pause in her work and stare at the ceiling, listening to sounds that only those who'd been upstairs could properly interpret. The truth lived in these silent moments, in the careful way workers avoided Moore's gaze, in the elaborate systems Grace had developed to minimize their master's displeasure. Every aspect of the household served to facilitate and conceal systematic torture that the law not only permitted but protected through the fundamental premise that enslaved people existed as property, rather than human beings deserving protection from cruelty. The first act of resistance came from an unexpected source. James Thompson, 15 years old and trying to become invisible among the field workers, began noticing patterns that the adults had learned to ignore as survival mechanism. He observed which enslaved people were summoned to the main house and when they returned. He tracked the timing of Moore's evening guests, the ones who arrived in covered carriages and departed before sunrise. Most importantly, he started documenting everything in his mind, memorizing details with the clarity of someone who understood that remembering might someday matter. His father worked alongside him in the cattle operations, both of them learning the routines that kept Moore's legitimate ranch functioning. The work was brutal but straightforward: mending fences, moving herds, repairing equipment. Samuel found himself almost grateful for the physical exhaustion that prevented him from thinking too much about Talise and Abigail trapped in the main house. But James couldn't stop thinking, couldn't stop observing, couldn't accept that survival meant closing your eyes to evil happening all around you. "There's a pattern to who gets taken upstairs," he whispered to his father during their 4th week at the ranch. They were fixing a fence post in a remote section of property, temporarily free from overseer supervision. Families with young ones. Always families. And they never last more than 3 months before someone disappears. Samuel wanted to tell his son to stop noticing, to protect himself through deliberate ignorance like the other workers had learned to do. But he recognized the same stubborn refusal to accept injustice that had gotten them sold south in the first place, when James had been caught teaching other enslaved people to read despite laws forbidding it. "What do you plan to do with this information?" Samuel asked quietly. "We're trapped here. No authorities who'd listen. No way to escape with your mother and sister locked in that house. Sometimes surviving means accepting what you can't change." "Maybe," James replied, his young face hardening with determination that belonged on someone decades older. "Or maybe surviving means finding the one person who will listen, no matter how long it takes." Inside the main house, Taling had formed a fragile alliance with Mia and Hannah, built not on words but on shared understanding of their impossible situation. The 3 women worked together in the kitchen, preparing elaborate meals for Moore and his occasional guests, while their own families suffered in ways they couldn't prevent. Mia had lost her husband to Moore's third-floor experiments 2 years ago. The man had been strong, defiant, everything Moore enjoyed breaking. She'd been forced to prepare his final meal, to carry food upstairs, knowing she'd never see him alive again. Her 2 young ones had been sold away afterward, punishment for their father's resistance. Hannah's story was different but equally devastating. She'd been purchased alone 5 years ago, before Moore began targeting families. She survived by becoming indispensable in the kitchen, by perfecting the ability to exist without displaying any emotion that might attract unwanted attention. But the cost of survival showed in her eyes. in the way her hands sometimes shook when she handled knives, in the nightmares that made her cry out in her sleep. Together, they taught Talise the unspoken rules of Moore's household. Never look him directly in the eyes. Never show fear, because fear excited him. Never resist when Grace summoned you upstairs, because resistance only made what happened next worse. Never ask questions about the screams that sometimes echoed through the house at night. But most importantly, they taught her about the small rebellions that kept hope alive, despite everything. Mia had been documenting Moore's crimes in a hidden journal, recording dates and details in careful handwriting that represented enormous risk. Hannah had been stealing small amounts of money over the years, hiding coins in places throughout the house that only she knew about. Both women harbored desperate fantasies about eventual escape, about justice, about a day when their testimonies might actually matter to someone with power to act. From Mia's hidden journal, entry dated October 1852, new woman, Talisa's, still has fight in her, dangerous, Grace already watching her close, but maybe that fight is what we need. Maybe someone who hasn't learned to accept horror as normal could be the one who finally exposes what happens here. Or maybe she'll just die quicker, like all the others who tried. Abigail's experience on the third floor existed beyond what her mother could imagine or her brother could document. Moore had perfected the art of psychological torture, understanding that physical pain was crude and temporary, compared to the lasting damage created by destroying someone's sense of self, their hope, their will to survive. She was kept in a locked room with two other girls near her age, daughters from previous families Moore had purchased. The three of them existed in a carefully controlled environment where every aspect of their lives served to demonstrate their complete powerlessness. Food arrived irregularly. Sleep was interrupted. Privacy was non-existent, and Moore's visits followed no predictable pattern, keeping them in constant state of terrified anticipation. But even in this nightmare, small acts of resistance emerged. The three girls developed a coded language of glances and gestures that allowed communication when words were forbidden. They shared scarce food equally despite hunger that made hoarding rational. They took turns staying awake to warn the others when footsteps approached their door. One girl, Emily, had been there longest, 8 weeks since her family was purchased. She taught the others that survival required splitting yourself into two people, the one who endured whatever Moore demanded, and the one who hid deep inside where he couldn't reach. It was a terrible lesson for young people to learn, but it was also the only path to maintaining sanity under impossible circumstances. The enslaved community began to recognize something different about the Thompson family. Most victims accepted their fate with the resignation of people who'd learned that resistance only made suffering worse. But the Thompsons kept trying to connect with each other across the barriers Moore had constructed to isolate them. Samuel found ways to leave small stones in places where Talise might find them during her rare moments outside the main house, each rock a message that he was still thinking of her, still fighting to maintain their bond. James memorized every detail about the ranch's layout, studying the patterns of guards and overseers, mapping potential escape routes even though the odds of successfully running made such planning seem futile. Talise and her kitchen allies began coordinating small acts of sabotage, oversalting Moore's food, deliberately burning dishes he'd requested, finding ways to make his life slightly less comfortable without triggering punishment severe enough to be deadly. These tiny rebellions accomplished nothing practical but maintained a sense of agency that kept them human despite being treated as property. Even Abigail, locked on the third floor, refused to surrender completely. She kept track of days by scratching marks on the wall beside her sleeping mat. She memorized details about Moore's routine, his habits, his preferences, storing information that might someday prove useful if opportunity for escape or revenge ever presented itself. The network of silent witnesses watching the Thompson family's resistance began to hope, despite knowing better. Logan started sharing more information with Samuel about the ranch's operations, pointing out which overseers were cruel by nature versus those who were simply following orders. Zarina, the old woman from the auction who'd tried to warn them, worked at a neighboring property but found ways to pass messages through the underground network of enslaved people who communicated across plantation boundaries. Most significantly, a man named Joseph, who worked in Moore's stables, began taking risks to help the family stay connected. He'd carry verbal messages between Samuel in the fields and Talise in the kitchen. Brief exchanges that allowed them to know each other still survived. He snuck extra food to the third floor when Grace wasn't watching, small amounts that might help the imprisoned girls maintain their strength. What drives people to resist even when resistance seems pointless? How do communities maintain hope in situations designed to crush all possibility of change? As November arrived at Moore's Ranch in 1852, the Thompson family's stubborn refusal to accept their fate quietly had begun inspiring others to remember they were human beings rather than property. But their resistance had also attracted Moore's attention in ways that would force a confrontation no one was prepared to survive. Moore's evening gatherings began in late November, and with them came revelations that transformed whispered suspicions into documented horror. Wealthy men from across 3 territories arrived after sunset in unmarked carriages, their faces concealed until they entered the main house, where lamplight and whiskey loosened tongues that daylight kept cautious. Joseph had worked Moore's stables for 3 years, long enough to recognize the pattern of these visits and understand what they meant. The guests were men like Moore, respectable on the surface but twisted underneath, men who discovered that slavery provided legal cover for appetites that would get them hanged in any civilized society that recognized enslaved people as human beings deserving protection. From Joseph's testimony, recorded years later during federal investigation, they called themselves the Brotherhood of Dominion. 8 men total, all wealthy landowners from Virginia to the Carolinas. They met quarterly at different ranches, sharing what they called research about pain tolerance, psychological breaking points, and optimal methods for extracting maximum suffering before death. They kept detailed records like it was science instead of murder. The third floor of Moore's house served as laboratory for experiments that had nothing to do with agriculture or economics. Moore had converted 6 rooms into specialized chambers, each designed for different aspects of his systematic study of human suffering. He documented everything with the meticulous care of someone who believed his work had scholarly value, recording observations about how different people responded to various forms of torture, how long bodies could survive under specific conditions, which psychological techniques produced the most complete destruction of will and identity. His library contained journals spanning 15 years, detailed accounts of hundreds of victims purchased specifically for these experiments. Families were preferred because their emotional bonds provided additional variables to study. Moore particularly enjoyed documenting how parents made impossible choices when forced to select which family member would suffer next, how hope died gradually as people realized no rescue was coming, how the human spirit could be systematically dismantled through careful application of physical and psychological pain. The Brotherhood members contributed their own observations during quarterly gatherings, comparing notes about techniques and results. They treated enslaved people as research subjects rather than victims, their wealth and social position insulating them from consequences, while the legal framework of slavery rendered their crimes invisible to authorities who might otherwise intervene. James discovered the scope of Moore's operation through careful observation and dangerous risk-taking. He'd noticed that certain outbuildings remained locked except during the Brotherhood's visits, and that heavily loaded wagons sometimes departed the ranch before dawn, heading toward the far pasture where fresh earth suggested recent digging. One night, while other workers slept, James slipped from the south quarters and made his way toward the main house. The risk was enormous. Discovery meant certain death, but he needed to understand what was happening to his sister, to all the families who disappeared into Moore's property and never emerged. The windows on the 3rd floor glowed with lamplight, despite the late hour. James climbed an oak tree that grew near the house, its branches offering glimpses through windows that revealed horrors his young mind struggled to process. He saw rooms fitted with restraints and implements whose purposes he could only guess at. He saw Moore and 3 guests observing something happening in a chamber James couldn't fully see, all of them taking notes like scholars at a lecture rather than men witnessing torture. Most devastating, he caught a brief glimpse of Abigail through one window, her face so changed by suffering that he barely recognized his own sister. She sat in a corner of a locked room, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly while staring at nothing. 2 other girls occupied the same space, all of them displaying the hollow expressions of people whose spirits had been methodically crushed. James nearly fell from the tree, his vision blurring with tears and rage, but he forced himself to remain still, to keep watching, to memorize every detail because bearing witness was the only power he possessed. He saw Grace moving through the third floor with mechanical efficiency, delivering food and water to locked rooms, facilitating horrors without expression or protest. He observed the careful systems Moore had established to maintain complete control over his victims, while documenting their suffering for his journals. The truth James uncovered that night went beyond individual cruelty to reveal systematic evil operating under slavery's legal protection. Moore wasn't an aberration, but rather the logical extension of a system that reduced human beings to property, that stripped away legal personhood, and rendered suffering invisible when it happened to people defined as less than human. From Moore's journal, entry dated November 1852, discovered during later investigation, subject Thompson F13 demonstrates remarkable resilience. Standard deprivation techniques produce temporary compliance, but core resistance persists. Subject's attachment to family unit provides leverage for next phase of study. Hypothesis: forcing subjects to witness each other's suffering produces more complete psychological destruction than individual isolation. Will test with Thompson family unit during December gathering. Mia's hidden documentation had been tracking Moore's patterns for 2 years, long before the Thompson family arrived. She'd recorded the names of 37 families purchased and destroyed during that period, noting dates of acquisition, length of survival, and approximate timing of deaths based on fresh graves appearing in the far pasture. Her journal revealed that Moore's operation had been escalating. Early entries described individual purchases and relatively quick deaths, but over time he'd refined his methods, learning to keep victims alive longer, to extract more suffering before they expired. The formation of the Brotherhood had accelerated this evolution, as members shared techniques and competed to document increasingly elaborate experiments. Hannah contributed different intelligence gathered through her kitchen work. She'd been forced to prepare special meals for the Brotherhood gatherings. Elaborate dinners served while men discussed their research as casually as farmers might discuss crop yields. She'd overheard enough fragments of conversation to understand that Moore's operation was part of a larger network, that similar facilities existed at other ranches across the South, that the Brotherhood was coordinating their efforts and sharing findings. Most chilling, she'd learned that Moore and his associates believed they were advancing human knowledge through their experiments. They convinced themselves that studying pain and suffering in enslaved subjects served scientific purposes, that their detailed documentation contributed to understanding of human psychology and physiology. They'd created an elaborate intellectual framework to justify torture, transforming sadism into scholarship through careful record-keeping and pseudo-scientific language. The enslaved community's fragmented knowledge began coalescing into a comprehensive understanding of what they faced. Logan shared information from field workers who'd noticed patterns of carriages and visitors. Zarina passed along intelligence from the underground network connecting enslaved people across multiple properties. Joseph contributed observations from the stables about which guests visited most frequently and what supplies they brought with them. Together they assembled a picture of systematic murder operating on industrial scale, protected by slavery's legal framework, and enabled by a society that refused to acknowledge enslaved people's humanity or suffering. Samuel learned the full truth during a whispered conversation with Logan in the darkness of the South Quarters. The older man had been holding back the worst details, trying to protect Samuel from knowledge that would drive him to suicidal resistance. But James's nighttime reconnaissance and Mia's documentation had made concealment impossible. "Your daughter's not being worked, she's being studied," Logan explained, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. Moore and his Brotherhood, they buy families to experiment on. They document how much pain people can endure, how relationships can be used to inflict psychological torture, how long they can keep someone alive while doing things I can't speak out loud. Samuel felt something break inside him, a fundamental shift from hope to desperation. "How long?" he asked. "How long do families usually last?" 3 months average, Logan replied. "Some less if they resist too hard, some longer if Moore finds them particularly interesting." "The Thompson family, you've been here 6 weeks. That means you got maybe 6 weeks left before he's done with you and moves on to the next purchase." The timeline created urgency that transformed passive suffering into active planning. If the Thompson family had limited time remaining, then any escape attempt, no matter how unlikely to succeed, became preferable to waiting for systematic destruction. If no legal authority would intervene because enslaved people's suffering didn't count as crime, then justice would need to come from other sources. Samuel, James, Talise, and their allies among the enslaved community began coordinating a plan born from desperation rather than hope. They would document everything Moore and his brotherhood were doing, gathering evidence that might eventually reach someone with both power and conscience to act. They would attempt to free the prisoners on the third floor, even though such rescue seemed impossible. Most importantly, they would ensure that if the Thompson family died at Moore's ranch, their deaths would expose crimes that slavery's legal framework had allowed to flourish in darkness. What separates human beings from monsters who wear human faces? How does systematic evil persist when witnesses surround it, watching and documenting but powerless to intervene? As December approached in 1852, the Thompson family's resistance evolved from survival strategy into something more dangerous, a determination to expose truth even if exposure cost them everything. But they hadn't yet discovered that Moore's final experiment would force them into impossible choices that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The federal postal inspector arrived at the territorial office in early December, his saddlebags heavy with intercepted correspondence that had been flagged by officials in Richmond who'd grown suspicious of certain patterns in letters traveling between wealthy landowners across 3 states. Michael Miller was a meticulous man who'd spent 20 years tracking fraud and corruption through careful analysis of mail, and something about the Brotherhood's correspondence had triggered his professional instincts. From Miller's official report dated December 1852, the letters employ coded language referring to agricultural research and livestock management, but the terminology suggests activities unrelated to legitimate farming operations. References to subject durability, experimental protocols, and comparative studies indicate organized coordination of activities that warrant federal investigation. Miller's involvement represented the first crack in the wall of silence protecting Moore's operation. While local authorities had ignored rumors about the ranch, federal jurisdiction over postal matters provided an avenue for investigation that Moore's political connections couldn't easily block. The inspector began building a case based on what the letters revealed about the Brotherhood's systematic coordination, but Moore had contingency plans for exactly this scenario. His network included judges, politicians, and law enforcement officials whose cooperation had been secured through a combination of blackmail, bribery, and shared participation in the Brotherhood's activities. When word reached him about Miller's investigation, he activated protocols designed to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses before federal authorities could build a prosecutable case. The December gathering of the Brotherhood took on new urgency. 8 men assembled at Moore's ranch with a dual purpose: conduct their quarterly research session and coordinate response to the federal threat. Their arrival triggered lockdown protocols that sealed the property and placed all enslaved workers under heightened surveillance designed to prevent any communication with outside authorities. James watched the preparations from his position in the fields, recognizing that something had changed in the ranch's normal operations. Additional armed guards patrolled the perimeter. All workers were confined to their quarters when not actively laboring. Most ominously, wagons were being loaded with supplies that suggested Moore was preparing for extended siege or rapid evacuation. "They know someone's investigating," Joseph whispered during a brief moment when the stable workers gathered to water horses, heard 2 of the guests talking. "Federal inspectors been asking questions in Richmond about letters and unusual shipments. Moore's planning to eliminate evidence before authorities arrive." The enslaved community understood immediately what eliminating evidence meant. Witnesses would be killed or sold away to distant locations. Documentation would be destroyed. The prisoners on the 3rd floor, including Abigail and the other girls, would be disposed of permanently to prevent their testimony. Moore and his Brotherhood would erase all traces of their crimes before federal inspection could uncover proof sufficient for prosecution. Mia made a desperate decision that night. She retrieved her hidden journal and all the documentation she'd accumulated over 2 years, wrapping the evidence in oilcloth and burying it in a location she described to Hannah and Talise through coded kitchen conversation. If she didn't survive what was coming, at least the record of Moore's crimes would endure for someone to eventually discover. From Mia's journal, final entry dated December 1852. "They're going to kill us all. I can see it in Grace's eyes, hear it in the way the overseers talk. Moore can't let any witnesses survive federal investigation. This journal is my testimony. If you're reading this, it means I'm dead, but the truth survived. Make it count." The Brotherhood's meeting on the third floor that evening revealed the full scope of their criminal network and their plans for self-preservation. Joseph managed to position himself near a window while ostensibly tending horses in the nearby stable, close enough to overhear fragments of conversation that exposed the conspiracy's true dimensions. 8 ranches across Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia served as research facilities where the Brotherhood conducted their experiments. They'd established a sophisticated communication network for sharing findings, coordinating purchases of promising subjects, and warning each other about potential threats to their operations. Over 15 years, they estimated having studied over 500 enslaved people purchased specifically for experimental purposes. Their journals documented everything in clinical language that disguised atrocity as scholarship, detailed observations about pain thresholds and psychological breaking points, comparative studies of how different ages, genders, and family structures responded to various forms of torture, hypotheses about human suffering tested through systematic brutality that they recorded as if conducting legitimate scientific research. One member, a man named Anthony White, who owned a cotton plantation in Georgia, had even presented their findings at a private medical conference in Charleston, framing the research as advances in understanding human psychology and physiology. The attendees, all doctors and academics, had applauded work they assumed involved voluntary subjects and ethical methodology, unaware they were celebrating systematic torture of enslaved people who had no legal recourse or protection. The federal inspector is a problem, Moore told the assembled Brotherhood, but not an insurmountable one. We have friends in the territorial government who can delay investigation. More importantly, we control all physical evidence. The subjects currently in residence will be disposed of within the week. Our journals will be relocated to secure locations. Any enslaved workers who might testify will be sold to Cuban sugar plantations where their life expectancy is measured in months, and their stories will die with them. The casual discussion of mass murder, delivered in the same tone one might use for planning crop rotation, demonstrated how completely the Brotherhood had dehumanized their victims. Enslaved people existed as research materials to be used and discarded, their suffering and death carrying no more moral weight than the destruction of laboratory equipment after experiments concluded. Joseph carried this intelligence back to the enslaved community that night, sparking desperate debate about response options. They could attempt to contact the federal inspector directly, but reaching him would require escaping the ranch's lockdown while evading armed guards, ordered to prevent exactly that. They could try to hide until federal authorities arrived, but Moore's plans to eliminate evidence included thorough searches that would uncover any concealment. Most devastating was the timeline. Moore planned to dispose of the third-floor prisoners within 1 week. That gave Samuel's community less than 7 days to either rescue Abigail and the other captives or watch them murdered to protect the Brotherhood's secrets. Talise learned additional details through the kitchen network. Grace had been ordered to prepare the third floor for what Moore called final protocols, which everyone understood meant executions disguised as natural deaths or accidents. The girls would be poisoned or smothered, their bodies buried in the far pasture alongside previous victims, all evidence of their suffering erased before federal inspection could document it. "We're running out of time," Talise told Mia and Hannah as they worked together preparing dinner for the Brotherhood's gathering. "They're going to kill our babies to protect themselves. We can't wait for authorities who might never come, or might arrive too late." Hannah touched the knife she'd been using to cut vegetables, her fingers trembling against the handle. "You talking about killing them? We'd never make it out alive." "Guards everywhere. They'd hang us slow for even trying." "Maybe," Talise replied, her voice steady despite the fear flooding her system. "But maybe dying while fighting is better than living after watching them murder our daughters without raising a hand to stop it." The conversation revealed a fundamental shift in the enslaved community's calculations. For years, they'd prioritized survival through compliance, accepting that resistance usually meant death, while cooperation offered slim chances of continued existence. But Moore's plan to eliminate all witnesses transformed the mathematics of resistance. If they were going to die anyway, then dying while fighting back became the rational choice. Samuel and Logan coordinated with field workers to map the ranch's defensive positions and identify potential weaknesses. James used his nighttime reconnaissance skills to study guard rotations and locate where weapons were stored. Joseph prepared horses in the stable that might facilitate escape if they somehow managed to free the third-floor prisoners. Mia, Hannah, and Talise discussed how kitchen access might provide opportunities to poison the Brotherhood's food or steal keys to the locked rooms upstairs. The plan that emerged was desperate and unlikely to succeed, but it represented the only path forward that didn't end in passive acceptance of mass murder. They would attempt simultaneous actions: create distraction in the fields to draw guards away from the main house, infiltrate the third floor to free the prisoners, steal horses and supplies for escape attempt, and somehow evade pursuit long enough to reach federal authorities with evidence of the Brotherhood's crimes. The odds of success approached zero. The odds of survivors approached equally dismal numbers. But the alternative was watching Moore eliminate everyone who could testify about his atrocities, allowing the Brotherhood to escape consequences and continue their systematic torture at other locations with new victims. "Even if we all die trying," Samuel told the assembled conspirators during their final planning session, "at least we die as people who fought back instead of property that accepted slaughter. And if even one of us survives to reach that federal inspector, if Mia's journal gets discovered, if any evidence makes it to authorities who'll actually listen, then maybe our deaths count for something beyond just being more victims in Moore's journals." What transforms oppressed people from passive victims into active resistors willing to sacrifice everything for slim chances of justice? How does systematic evil create the conditions for desperate courage among those it seeks to destroy? As the first week of December 1852 drew to a close at Moore's ranch, the enslaved community prepared for an uprising born not from hope of success, but from refusal to die quietly. The Brotherhood believed they'd perfected a system that rendered their crimes invisible and their victims powerless. They were about to discover that even people defined as property could choose how their stories ended, and that some truths refused to stay buried no matter how carefully murderers try to conceal them. The December cold settled over Moore's ranch like a burial shroud as the enslaved community made final preparations for an uprising that would likely end in their deaths. Ice formed on water troughs while frost turned the grasslands silver under a moon that seemed to watch their desperate planning with indifferent patience. Samuel Thompson sat in the darkness of the South Quarters, surrounded by men who'd chosen resistance over passive slaughter, knowing that the next 72 hours would determine whether their suffering had meaning beyond entries in Moore's experimental journals. Logan had mapped every guard position, every patrol route, every weakness in the ranch's security that might provide fractional advantages during the chaos they were about to unleash. The overseers rotated in predictable patterns, their confidence born from years of unopposed authority over people they considered incapable of organized resistance. That arrogance would be their vulnerability. 3 guards on the main house at night, Logan explained, using stones on the dirt floor to represent positions. 2 more patrol the perimeter. 1 stays in the overseer's cabin. Moore keeps the Brotherhood guests in the east wing, 2nd floor. The prisoners, your daughter and the others, they're locked on the 3rd floor with Grace holding the only keys. James had contributed detailed intelligence from his nighttime observations. Grace sleeps in a room adjacent to the locked chambers. She's older, not physically strong. If we can get to her quietly, take the keys without raising alarm, we might have 15 minutes before anyone notices the prisoners are gone. 15 minutes to free captives who'd been systematically tortured for weeks or months. 15 minutes to navigate through a house filled with armed men. 15 minutes to reach the stables where Joseph would have horses prepared for escape. The timeline was impossibly tight, but it was all they had. Talise and the kitchen workers had been stockpiling supplies that might aid the escape attempt. Small amounts of food disappeared from Moore's pantry, redistributed to hiding spots near the stable. Blankets and warm clothing were secretly relocated to facilitate survival during winter flight through territory, where any black person traveling without papers faced immediate suspicion and capture. Most dangerously, Talise had been experimenting with substances from the kitchen that might incapacitate without killing. Moore's medicine cabinet contained laudanum and other sedatives intended for the prisoners upstairs. If she could drug the Brotherhood's evening meal, the resulting confusion might provide the distraction needed for the escape attempt to succeed. Poison them all, Hannah had suggested with cold fury born from years of watching men like Moore operate with impunity. Put enough in their food to kill every one of those monsters. Let them die the way they've killed so many others. But Talise had refused, not from mercy but from tactical calculation. Dead bodies bring investigations we can't control. Federal inspectors already asking questions. We need Moore and his brotherhood alive to face justice, to testify about the network, to expose the whole system. We just need them unconscious long enough for us to run. The debate revealed fundamental tension between vengeance and justice, between the satisfaction of immediate retaliation and the longer-term goal of exposing crimes that extended far beyond one ranch. The enslaved community had earned the right to violence against their tormentors. But violence would also eliminate evidence needed to prosecute the broader conspiracy. From Samuel's testimony, recorded years later, we had every reason to kill them, every right to become the monsters they'd made us out to be, but we chose different. Chose to believe that truth and testimony mattered more than revenge. Maybe we were fools. Maybe we should have burned that house down with all of them inside. But we wanted the world to know what happened there. Wanted their crimes documented in courts and newspapers. Wanted justice instead of just more death. Joseph had prepared 4 horses in the stable, the strongest animals capable of carrying multiple riders across rough terrain during winter flight. He'd hidden supplies in saddlebags, dried food, water containers, blankets, and most critically, Mia's journal wrapped in protective oilcloth. If nothing else survived the escape attempt, that documentation had to reach federal authorities. The territorial border is 40 miles northeast, Joseph explained during final planning. If we can reach federal jurisdiction before Moore's people catch us, the inspector can provide protection. But 40 miles through winter, with trackers and dogs chasing us, carrying people who've been starved and tortured for months, that's asking for miracles we got no right to expect. The plan's desperation showed in every detail. They would move during the Brotherhood's final dinner gathering, when all 8 men would be assembled in the dining room. Talise would serve the drugged meal, hoping the sedatives took effect before anyone noticed symptoms. Simultaneously, Samuel and Logan would create distraction in the south quarters, drawing guards away from the main house. James would infiltrate through the kitchen entrance, make his way to the 3rd floor, overpower Grace, and free the prisoners. Once the captives were released, they'd move quickly to the stable where Joseph would have horses ready. The entire operation depended on split-second timing, multiple simultaneous actions succeeding perfectly, and luck they had no reason to expect. Any single failure point would collapse the entire attempt and result in executions that would make Moore's previous tortures seem merciful by comparison. The night before the planned uprising, Samuel managed brief contact with Talise through Joseph's message relay. He sent word that he loved her, that whatever happened in the next 48 hours, their 15 years together had been the only good thing in a life defined by bondage and suffering. She sent back similar message, adding that Abigail was still alive on the 3rd floor, still fighting despite everything Moore had done to break her spirit. That knowledge, that their daughters still possessed some ember of resistance that torture hadn't fully extinguished, gave Samuel strength for what was coming. They weren't just fighting for survival or revenge. They were fighting to reclaim their daughter's future, to give her chance at life beyond Moore's experimental chambers, to prove that even systematic evil couldn't completely destroy the bonds that made them family. Mia spent her final night of preparation adding last entries to her hidden journal, documenting the escape plan and the reasoning behind it. If they failed and she died, she wanted the record to show they'd chosen action over passive acceptance, that they'd fought back even knowing the odds made success nearly impossible. "We are human beings," she wrote in careful script, "not property, not research subjects, not animals to be studied and discarded. We have names, families, stories that matter beyond the suffering others inflicted on us. If this journal survives when we don't, let it testify that we died as people who refused to accept what they called us. Let it bear witness that we fought." The other enslaved workers on the ranch faced terrible choices about their own participation. Joining the uprising meant risking execution if it failed. But remaining passive meant potential complicity if Moore decided to eliminate all witnesses regardless of their involvement. Some chose to help actively, accepting the risks. Others chose strategic ignorance, positioning themselves to survive regardless of outcome. No one judged those who prioritized survival over resistance, understanding that courage manifested differently depending on individual circumstances and obligations. Hannah made peace with probable death by focusing on purpose beyond personal survival. She'd lived 5 years watching Moore torture innocent people while she prepared his meals and maintained his household. The guilt of that complicity weighed heavier than fear of dying during escape attempt. If the uprising gave meaning to those 5 years of forced participation in evil, if her death helped expose the Brotherhood's crimes, then dying would be preferable to continued existence as Moore's enabler. As December 14th dawned cold and clear, the conspirators moved through their assigned tasks with the calm that comes from accepting likely death. Samuel worked the cattle operations while memorizing every detail of the ranch's layout. James positioned tools and supplies that might aid the evening's infiltration. Talise prepared the Brotherhood's final meal with hands that trembled only slightly as she measured sedatives into serving dishes. Joseph made final checks on horses and equipment, ensuring everything was ready for flight that might never happen. The Brotherhood members spent the day reviewing their journals and discussing contingency plans for federal investigation. They remained confident that their wealth and connections would protect them from serious consequences, even if the postal inspector uncovered evidence of their activities. Enslaved people's testimony carried no legal weight. Physical evidence could be destroyed or relocated. Friendly judges and politicians would ensure any investigation died quietly without prosecution. But they'd underestimated the desperation of people who'd been pushed beyond the point where survival outweighed resistance. They'd forgotten that even the most oppressed populations eventually reach breaking points where death becomes preferable to continued submission. Most critically, they'd failed to recognize that their systematic documentation of crimes, the journals they considered scholarly achievement, would become evidence of conspiracy once those records fell into hands of investigators who recognized enslaved people's humanity. As sunset approached on December 14, 1852, two groups prepared for confrontation that would determine whether the Thompson family's suffering had purpose beyond entries in Moore's experimental records. The Brotherhood gathered for dinner, confident in their power and invulnerability. The enslaved conspirators made final preparations for uprising, born from desperation rather than hope. Between them lay hours that would transform victims into witnesses, expose evil that had hidden behind wealth and respectability, and prove that some truths refused to stay buried, no matter how carefully murderers try to conceal them. The dining room chandelier cast dancing shadows across the Brotherhood's final gathering as Talise entered carrying the first course, her heart hammering against her ribs while her hands remained steady through years of practice, hiding fear from masters who fed on it. 8 wealthy men sat around Moore's mahogany table, discussing experimental protocols and research findings as casually as farmers might debate weather patterns. None of them noticed the kitchen woman's trembling breath or the careful way she avoided making eye contact that might reveal her terror. The laudanum had been measured precisely, enough to incapacitate without killing, distributed evenly across 8 servings of butternut squash soup that Moore had specifically requested for the evening's menu. Talise placed each bowl with methodical care, watching the men lift spoons to mouths while she retreated to the kitchen where Hannah and Mia waited with expressions that showed they understood these might be the last moments of their lives. "How long before it takes effect?" Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the Brotherhood's dinner conversation drifting from the dining room. 20 minutes, Talise replied, forcing herself to breathe normally despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Maybe less if they drink the wine I dosed. Maybe more if their constitutions are strong. We won't know until they start showing symptoms." In the South Quarters, Samuel and Logan were implementing their part of the coordinated plan. They'd staged a fight between workers, shouting and crashing that brought guards running from their posts near the main house. The altercation appeared spontaneous, 2 men driven to violence by the constant pressure of enslavement and suffering. But every punch was calculated, every shout timed to maintain distraction for the 15 minutes James needed to infiltrate the 3rd floor. James moved through shadows along the main house's exterior, using the oak tree he'd climbed during previous reconnaissance to reach a 2nd-floor window left deliberately unlocked by Talise during her morning cleaning duties. The climb was treacherous, ice making the branches slippery while armed guards patrolled below. One mistake, one snapped branch or misplaced foothold, and the entire operation would collapse before it properly began. He pulled himself through the window into a hallway that smelled of expensive tobacco and human suffering. The sounds of the Brotherhood's dinner echoed from below while above him. Behind locked doors on the 3rd floor, His sister and the other prisoners waited, unknowing for rescue that might never arrive. Grace Harris sat in her small room adjacent to the locked chambers, going through her nightly routine with the mechanical efficiency that had allowed her to survive 15 years as Moore's administrator. She'd just finished documenting the day's activities in her own journal, a record she kept to protect herself from accusations of negligence, when her door burst open, and James Thompson appeared with a kitchen knife he'd stolen from Talisa's workspace. "The keys," he said quietly, the blade steady despite his young hands. "Give me the keys to the locked rooms, and I won't hurt you." Grace looked at him with eyes that held no surprise, only the tired resignation of someone who'd been expecting this moment for years. "You're making a mistake," she said, not moving toward the key ring on her belt. "Moore will kill everyone involved, your whole family, everyone who helped you. Running just makes the dying slower." "We're already dying," James replied. "At least this way we choose how it happens. The keys, now." What passed between them in that moment transcended simple threat and compliance. Grace had spent 15 years facilitating Moore's tortures, but she'd also been enslaved her entire life, had endured her own suffering before learning that survival required becoming what her master needed. She looked at this young man threatening her with a knife and saw the person she might have been if circumstances had been different, if she'd chosen resistance over collaboration. She unhooked the keys from her belt and held them out. "Third door on the left," she said softly. "That's where your sister is, 2 other girls with her. They're weak, been starved and worse. You'll need to carry them." James took the keys, his eyes searching Grace's face for signs of deception or trap. "Why are you helping?" "I'm not," Grace replied. "I'm just done stopping you. There's a difference." The locked door opened to reveal a chamber that would haunt James's nightmares for the rest of his life. 3 girls huddled in the corner, their bodies bearing marks of systematic torture that Moore had documented in his journals with clinical precision. Abigail looked up at her brother with eyes that seemed not to recognize him at first, her mind struggling to accept that rescue might actually be happening after weeks of learning that hope was just another form of torture. "James," she whispered, her voice raw from screaming that had long since stopped producing sound. "Is this real, or is this another test?" He crossed the room and pulled her into an embrace that felt like holding a skeleton wrapped in skin. "It's real. We're getting you out. Can you walk?" The other 2 girls, Emily and Scarlett, were in worse condition. Emily had been Moore's prisoner for 3 months, her body and mind so thoroughly broken that she could barely respond to external stimuli. Scarlett had only been there 6 weeks, but had resisted violently, earning punishment that left her unable to walk without support. Downstairs, the laudanum was beginning to take effect on the Brotherhood members. Anthony White slumped forward into his dessert plate, his fork clattering against china. Moore noticed the man's sudden unconsciousness and started to rise, his mind processing the possibility of poisoning, even as his own muscles began failing to respond to commands. Around the table, 7 other men fought against sedation that pulled them toward unconsciousness, despite their struggles to remain alert. "The food," Moore managed to say, his words slurring as the drugs overwhelmed his system. "She poisoned us." But by then it was too late for warnings or preventative action. The Brotherhood members collapsed across Moore's dining table like puppets with severed strings, their elaborate dinner gathering transformed into a scene that would have been comical if the stakes weren't measured in human lives. Talise didn't wait to confirm complete incapacitation before moving to the next phase. She grabbed the satchel where Mia had hidden her journal and critical documentation, then ran toward the main staircase where James should be descending with the freed prisoners. The timing had to be perfect. Any delay meant guards discovering the escape before they reached the stables. James appeared at the top of the stairs carrying Scarlett, while Abigail and Emily leaned on each other for support. The group moved with agonizing slowness, each step a struggle for girls whose bodies had been systematically weakened by months of torture and starvation. In the south quarters, Samuel's staged fight had drawn 3 guards away from their posts, but the altercation couldn't be maintained much longer without arousing suspicion. Logan threw one final punch that sent Samuel sprawling, then both men allowed themselves to be restrained by guards who hadn't yet realized the distraction's true purpose. Joseph waited in the stables with 4 horses saddled and ready, his ears straining for sounds of approach while his hands checked equipment one final time. The entire operation depended on multiple simultaneous actions succeeding perfectly, and he knew from experience that complex plans usually collapsed at their weakest points. The weak point came as James's group reached the main floor and encountered a guard who'd been stationed inside the house rather than drawn away by the fight in the quarters. The man's eyes widened as he processed the scene. Kitchen workers helping prisoners escape, the locked third floor somehow breached, the sounds of unconscious Brotherhood members in the dining room behind them. He reached for the pistol at his belt while opening his mouth to shout alarm that would bring every armed man on the property running. But Mia was faster, years of suppressed rage exploding into action as she grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the kitchen and swung it with all her strength against the guard's skull. The impact produced a sickening crack, and the man crumpled without completing his warning shout. "Go!" Mia screamed at the others. "Get to the stables!" "I'll hold anyone else who comes." Tuflis hesitated, not wanting to abandon her friend but knowing that delay meant death for everyone. "Come with us." "Can't," Mia replied, already positioning herself to defend the exit. "Someone has to slow them down. Someone has to make sure you get enough head start to matter. Take my journal. Make them know what happened here. Make my testimony count." The scene captured everything about desperate resistance. The impossible choices, the sacrifices that bought fractional advantages, the way survival often required leaving people behind, even as it demanded honoring their courage through successful escape. James and Thalise half-carried the freed prisoners toward the stables, while behind them Mia prepared to face guards who would show no mercy to a woman who just knocked their colleague unconscious. Hannah appeared from the kitchen carrying knives, taking position beside Mia with grim determination that showed she'd also chosen to make her final stand, buying time for others to escape. Joseph saw them coming across the open ground between house and stable, a struggling group moving far too slowly with guards who would notice their absence within minutes. He led the horses out to meet them, calculating that mounting and riding would be faster than expecting the weakened girls to walk the remaining distance. "Samuel?" Thalise gasped as she reached Joseph. "Where's Samuel?" "Still in the south quarters with Logan," Joseph replied while helping Abigail onto the first horse. "Guards took them after the fight. We can't wait." The choice tore at Thalise's heart. Flee with her daughter and the evidence that might expose Moore's crimes, or stay and try to free her husband knowing such attempt would likely fail. She looked at Abigail, seeing her daughter's desperate need for medical care and safety that only escape could provide. She thought of Samuel, who'd told her through Joseph's messages that saving their daughter mattered more than his own survival. "He'd want us to run," she said, the words tasting like betrayal even as she spoke them. "He'd want Abigail safe." Behind them, at the main house, shouts began rising as guards discovered unconscious Brotherhood members and missing prisoners. Within seconds, alarm bells would ring, and the entire ranch would mobilize for pursuit. The window for successful escape was closing rapidly, measured in moments rather than minutes. The 4 horses carried 7 people, James and Abigail on one, Thalise and Scarlett on another, Joseph and Emily sharing the third, while the 4th bore supplies and Mia's journal wrapped in protective oilcloth. They rode northeast toward the territorial border 40 miles distant, knowing that trackers and dogs would follow as soon as Moore's people organized pursuit. At the main house, Mia and Hannah stood back-to-back in the main hallway, armed with kitchen implements against guards carrying pistols and rifles. They knew their resistance would last minutes at most, but those minutes might mean the difference between successful escape and capture for the people they'd helped flee. "Been good knowing you," Hannah said to Mia as armed men appeared at both ends of the corridor. "Been good fighting back," Mia replied, finally. The winter dawn broke across the territorial border as 4 exhausted horses stumbled to a halt outside the Federal Marshal Station in Greenfield Junction, their riders barely conscious after 40 miles of desperate flight through freezing darkness. Thornhill Thompson slid from her mount and collapsed onto frozen ground, her daughter Abigail clutched against her chest like a treasure she'd refused to release even in death. James and Joseph helped Emily and Scarlett down from their horses, both girls so weakened by months of torture that they could no longer sit upright without support. Federal Marshal Michael Miller emerged from the station, his experienced eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to processing human suffering. He saw the marks of systematic abuse on the rescued girls, the desperation in the faces of those who'd fled, and the protective way they clutched a bundle wrapped in oilcloth like it, contained evidence more valuable than gold. Moore's ranch, Talise gasped through cracked lips. The Brotherhood, we have proof, we have everything. What followed transformed a local horror into a federal case that would expose systematic murder operating across 3 states under slavery's legal protection. Miller's investigation, combined with Mia's meticulously documented journal and the testimony of survivors, revealed crimes that shocked even officials accustomed to confronting the institution's worst abuses. The journal alone contained evidence sufficient for prosecution: dates and names of 37 families purchased and destroyed over 2 years, detailed descriptions of Moore's experimental protocols, copied excerpts from correspondence between Brotherhood members discussing their research, and observations about the network of ranches conducting similar operations across the South. But the physical evidence on the rescued girls' bodies provided even more damning proof. Medical examination documented injuries consistent with systematic torture, malnutrition resulting from deliberate starvation, and psychological trauma that physicians recognized as resulting from prolonged abuse rather than normal labor conditions. Most critically, the survivors could testify. Abigail, Emily, and Scarlett had witnessed Moore's activities firsthand, had endured his experiments, had heard conversations between Brotherhood members that revealed the conspiracy's scope. Their voices, combined with documentation and physical evidence, created a prosecution case that Moore's wealth and political connections couldn't easily dismiss. From Marshall Miller's official report dated December 1852, the evidence indicates systematic conspiracy involving at least 8 prominent landowners who purchased enslaved people specifically for experimental torture. The operation was coordinated across multiple properties, documented in detailed journals, and protected by a network of corrupt officials who ignored reports of suspicious deaths and disappearances. The surviving victims provide eyewitness testimony to crimes that challenge our fundamental assumptions about the limits of human cruelty. The federal raid on Moore's ranch came 3 days after the Thompson family's escape, coordinated between multiple jurisdictions to prevent local authorities from warning the Brotherhood. Marshals arrived at dawn to find evidence of hasty attempts to destroy documentation. But Moore's arrogance had worked against him. 15 years of journals couldn't be eliminated in 3 days, and the Brotherhood members were still on the property when federal authorities surrounded the main house. Samuel Thompson was discovered locked in a punishment cell in the South Quarters, barely alive after 3 days without food or water. Moore had kept him as potential bargaining chip, or future subject for retaliation experiments, not knowing that his value as witness would exceed any use as torture victim. His rescue and reunion with his family provided one of the few moments of genuine hope in a case otherwise defined by overwhelming horror. Mia Davis and Hannah Clark had died defending the escape route, their bodies discovered in the main hallway where they'd held off guards long enough for the others to reach the stables. Both women received posthumous recognition during the federal investigation, their courage documented in official reports that acknowledged how their sacrifice had made the entire prosecution possible. The trials began in spring 1853 and continued for 18 months as prosecutors methodically exposed the Brotherhood's crimes. Matthew Moore faced charges of conspiracy to commit murder, torture, and operating a criminal enterprise under cover of legitimate agricultural business. His 7 associates faced similar accusations, their wealth and social position providing no protection once federal jurisdiction applied. The proceedings revealed details that newspapers initially refused to print, considering them too disturbing for public consumption. Moore's journals documented over 500 victims across 15 years, families purchased specifically for experimental purposes, and destroyed systematically once their usefulness ended. The Brotherhood had coordinated their activities, sharing findings and competing to develop increasingly elaborate methods for inflicting suffering, while keeping subjects alive as long as possible. Their defense attorneys argued that enslaved people were property under law, that owners possessed absolute authority over their possessions, and that internal management of enslaved populations fell outside federal jurisdiction. The legal framework of slavery provided theoretical cover for actions that would constitute murder and torture if directed at people recognized as fully human under law. But the prosecution countered that even property rights had limits, that deliberate torture served no legitimate agricultural purpose, and that coordinated conspiracy across state lines brought federal authority into play. More fundamentally, they argued that some acts were crimes regardless of victims' legal status, that systematic murder couldn't be justified by property law, and that the Brotherhood's documentation proved premeditation incompatible with claims of legitimate business operations. The verdicts came in autumn 1854. Moore received a death sentence for crimes that included multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and torture. 4 Brotherhood members received similar sentences, while the remaining 3 got life imprisonment. The convictions represented unprecedented federal intervention in matters usually considered internal to slavery's operation, establishing legal precedent that property rights didn't extend to systematic torture and murder. But the trial's broader impact transcended individual convictions. The case forced public acknowledgement of horrors that society had preferred to ignore, exposed corruption protecting criminal behavior, and demonstrated that enslaved people's testimony could carry legal weight when properly documented and corroborated. The Brotherhood's journals, intended as scholarly achievement, became evidence of systematic evil operating under slavery's protection. Talese and Samuel Thompson testified during the trials despite enormous personal cost. Reliving their experiences traumatized them repeatedly, and their testimony exposed them to threats from slavery's defenders who viewed the prosecution as an attack on the entire institution. But they persisted because they understood their voices represented hundreds of victims who hadn't survived to speak for themselves. From Talese's testimony, transcript dated June 1853, "They bought us like cattle, but treated us worse than any farmer would treat livestock. Animals get fed, get basic care, because they're valuable. We got studied like specimens under glass, our suffering documented like it was scientific research instead of murder. My daughter spent 6 weeks locked in rooms where they did things I still can't speak about without breaking. And they wrote it all down, proud of their work, believing their journals proved something about human nature, instead of just proving they were monsters." Abigail's recovery took years and remained incomplete even decades later. The psychological damage from systematic torture left scars that time couldn't fully heal. But she chose to transform her trauma into purpose, becoming an advocate for enslaved people's protection and a voice demanding accountability for crimes committed under slavery's legal cover. Emily Johnson died 2 years after the rescue, her body finally succumbing to injuries sustained during 3 months as Moore's prisoner. Scarlett Martin survived, but never fully regained the ability to trust others, spending her life isolated and haunted by memories that dominated her waking hours and invaded her dreams. The federal investigation expanded beyond Moore's ranch to examine the other Brotherhood properties mentioned in correspondence and journals. Raids across Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia uncovered similar operations, though most had destroyed evidence more successfully than Moore's hasty attempts. Additional prosecutions followed, though none achieved the comprehensive documentation that made the original case so compelling. The enslaved communities at these properties had been documenting crimes for years, maintaining hidden records like Mia's journal that provided evidence once authorities finally chose to investigate. Their collective testimony revealed that the Brotherhood represented just one network among several, that systematic torture under slavery's protection operated more widely than even the federal prosecutors initially understood. Joseph Miller, the stable worker who'd prepared horses for the escape, gained his freedom through the investigation and became a key witness in subsequent trials. Logan Martinez received similar recognition, his years of observing Moore's patterns providing crucial context for understanding the operation's evolution. Both men dedicated their later lives to exposing slavery's worst abuses and advocating for the institution's complete abolition. The Thompson family relocated to Pennsylvania after the trials concluded, seeking distance from Virginia and the memories that haunted every familiar landscape. Samuel found work as a carpenter while Talese took in sewing to supplement their income. James continued his self-education, eventually becoming a teacher who used his experiences to illustrate the human cost of systematic oppression. They lived with knowledge that their survival came at enormous cost. The families who'd been destroyed before federal investigation intervened. The witnesses like Mia and Hannah who'd sacrificed themselves to enable escape. The countless victims whose stories remained undocumented because they hadn't survived to testify and no one had preserved evidence of their suffering. From Samuel's memoir, written decades later. We carry the dead with us every day. Their names, their faces, their stories that died with them, because Moore burned their bodies in unmarked graves. We survived not because we were stronger or smarter, but because timing and luck aligned in ways we couldn't control. That knowledge is both blessing and burden. We lived to bear witness, but witnessing means remembering what we'd prefer to forget. The Moore Ranch stood abandoned after the trials, its buildings slowly deteriorating while the land returned to wild grassland. Local legend claimed the property was haunted by spirits of victims seeking justice that legal proceedings couldn't fully provide. Whether ghosts were real or metaphorical, the place carried weight of suffering that marked the landscape long after physical structures crumbled. The Brotherhood's journals, preserved as evidence during trials, eventually entered federal archives where they remained sealed for decades. When historians finally gained access, the documents provided devastating insight into how systematic evil operates when legal frameworks permit treating human beings as property. The clinical language Moore and his associates used couldn't disguise the fundamental sadism of their enterprise. The way they'd constructed elaborate intellectual justifications for torture that served no purpose beyond satisfying twisted appetites. Contemporary analysis of the case revealed patterns that extended beyond individual cruelty to expose slavery's structural violence. The institution didn't just permit the Brotherhood's crimes, but actively enabled them by denying enslaved people legal personhood, by creating property rights that superseded human rights, by establishing systems where suffering became invisible because victims' testimonies carried no legal weight. The Thompson family's story became part of the broader historical record, documenting slavery's horrors and the resistance that challenged it. Their survival and testimony contributed to growing pressure for abolition, providing concrete examples of why the institution couldn't be reformed but only eliminated. The case demonstrated that slavery's fundamental premise, that some humans could own others as property, created conditions where systematic torture became legally protected business practice. As the years passed and the Thompson family aged, they maintained contact with other survivors and witnesses from Moore's ranch. Annual gatherings brought together people bound by shared trauma and shared determination that their suffering would serve purposes beyond their individual stories. They raised money for escaped slaves seeking freedom, supported legal challenges to slavery's expansion, and testified before legislative bodies considering abolition measures. Tallis Thompson died in 1889, having lived to see slavery's legal end but not its legacy's resolution. Her final words, recorded by her daughter Abigail, spoke to the incomplete nature of justice achieved through survival. "We won in court but lost so much getting there. The Brotherhood died on gallows or in prison, but the system that protected them, that made our suffering legal and our testimonies worthless, that system survived in different forms. Until we reckon with that truth, until we acknowledge that law protected evil because it didn't recognize our humanity, the dead won't rest, and neither should we." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.